Don't worry, don't worry. Raheem Morris's new look defense won't mean changing roles for Kaden Elliss or the rest of the Falcons linebacker.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code in all lowercase LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. And guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black, aka Mr. aka. And I've been covering the Falcons for far too long, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, but still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I appreciate each and every one of you that are going strong with me. Shout out to the everydayers that tune into this illustrious pod each and every day as their first listen or first watch of the day. You too can become an everydayer by all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So, today we're continuing our positional reviews, looking at the linebacker core. And unlike previous episodes where we've been trying to balance like coaching hires and doing these positional reviews, today we're just going to do a full show talking linebackers. And I'm sure some of you are like, well, linebackers is not that interesting. Oh, my friend, you don't know, right? We're going to be talking about why Troy Andersen, should be regaining that starting spot next to Kaden Elliss over a Nate Landman because it potentially raises the ceiling for this Falcons defense. We'll talk about whether or not the Falcons need to add a linebacker, looking more for depth, or, maybe they could be shopping for starters this offseason. But we'll start with an overview of how this past season went for the linebacker position and sort of if a new scheme change under Raheem Morris is going to change things up, especially for a player like Kaden Elliss, who is seemingly such a great fit in the Ryan Nielsen defense. And when we look back at the season, right, the linebacker position was a relative strength for the Falcons, but, it wasn't as strong as it could have been because the injury to Troy Andersen, that torn pectoral muscle that he suffered in that week 3 Lions game, kind of threw a wrench into their general defensive plans, I think. Right, that we talked about after that Lions game on the All 22 review that week. We talked about how the Falcons kind of unveiled their Ruby dime defense, that 3-2-6 dime defense, right, where their 3 down linemen were Calais Campbell, Grady Jarrett, and David Onyemata. The 2 linebackers were Kaden Elliss and Troy Andersen, with Ellis sort of functioning as the 4th pass rusher alongside those 3 down linemen, while Andersen being more of the coverage linebacker. And then, of course, you had the 6 defensive backs, which included 3 corners and 3 safeties. And the Falcons, because of that Troy Andersen injury, did not fully unveil the Ruby defense as they wanted to, right? They still played a lot of dime, right? But it was more of that 4-1-6 dime defense with 4 down linemen and 1 linebacker for much of the rest of the season, right? And they alternated sort of back and forth. And a lot of that was due to the Falcons not being wholly comfortable with Nate Landman in coverage like they were with Troy Andersen lining up next to Kaden Elliss. And Kaden Elliss, whose primary function this past season was meant to be this pass rushing, guru, maven, whatever you want to call it. He wound up being more of a coverage guy than he was expected to be because he was just a little bit more athletic than Nate Landman was. And so he had to be able to match up a little bit more in coverage. But you sit here and you wonder, with Ryan Nielsen departing, Kaden Elliss coming from New Orleans, being a Ryan Nielsen guy, right? Is Kaden Elliss going to fit into the vision of this Raheem Morris defense? And I don't think that's really a concern because I don't think Raheem Morris is going to do things drastically differently than what Ryan Nielsen did this past year. He'll probably call less cover 2 man. Like that's really the biggest change that you'll probably see from the schematic standpoint this year under Raheem Morris and Jimmy Lake, the new defensive coordinator. But when we talk about Kaden Elliss, what was he brought in to be? What was he paid to be? A pass rusher, right? And you saw glimpses of that pass rushing ability, just not enough because of the reasons we talked about with the injury to Troy Andersen. And in the 7 games where Kaden Elliss was, according to PFF, asked to rush the quarterback 6 or more times, in those games, he racked up 4 sacks and 17 pressures, right? And that number should have been higher than 7 games. I think the plan was for that to be all 17 games. And so theoretically, you could have doubled that sort of production, and Kaden Elliss could have been an 8-sack, 30-plus pressure guy this past season had that injury to Troy Andersen not occurred. And we go back to the offseason conversation around Kaden Elliss. We talked about how he had the potential to be a double-digit sack guy in 2023, and he was kind of your best bet. If anybody was going to be a double-digit sack guy in 2023, it was Kaden Elliss. And while he didn't fall, he fell well short of those numbers. When you look at that potential, again, of potentially being an 8-sack guy, you understand that he wasn't super, super far off, at least on a per-game basis and whatnot. So, is Elliss going to be used similarly to how he was used will he be used in Morris's defense the same way, Morris and Lake's defense, I should say, Lake's calling plays, as he was in Nielsen's? And I think you will, right? Because you look at how Raheem Morris used Ernest Jones last year, very similar, right? Where Ernest Jones was rushing the quarterback a lot on these simulated pressures, right? The Rams, according to Cody Alexander on Twitter, ran the 3rd highest rate of simulated pressures in the NFL last year. And we talked a lot about simulated pressures ahead of the 2022 season as sort of a thing that was going to be the final piece to the Dean Pease defense. But for those of you that need a reminder, essentially, if you break it down to its basis, right, on a simulated pressure, you're rushing 4. And which 4 you're rushing is unknown. But generally speaking, in this specific situation, we're talking about that linebacker being that 4th rusher. And then that usually means that you drop one of your D linemen, right? And I haven't studied the Rams defense in depth, from this past year. At some point, we will get to that this offseason. But from what I gather, what research I've done so far is primarily for the Rams, that 4th rusher was a linebacker in Ernest Jones. And that defensive lineman dropping was their edge rusher, Michael Hoyt. And it's funny because you could see a similar thing happening with the Falcons dropping their edge rushers, like an Arnold Ebiketie, like a D'Angelo Malone, like a Lorenzo Carter. And I recall going back to October where, Tori McElhaney of AtlantaFalcons.com tweeted, "Oh, Arnold Ebiketie and D'Angelo Malone are getting linebacker snaps and coverage and whatnot." And Falcons Twitter freaked out, right? And not to go on a Twitter rant, but, this is why the discourse about football on Twitter is terrible, right? Because those people that were freaking out about, oh my God, I can't believe these edge rushers are learning linebacker drills and coverage drills, didn't understand this whole notion of simulated pressures and how it's sort of taken the league by storm. The Ravens did it to a huge degree, which was a big reason why their defense had so much success this year. And it's clearly, to me, all those people that freaked out about, oh my God, Arnold Ebiketie's getting linebacker reps, the sky is falling, are true non-knowers of ball. They just sort of expose themselves with that. You just don't get how modern defenses work. But that being said, before we talk about Troy Andersen, Nate Landman, I did get an email in regards to Kaden Elliss. It comes from Jim. He sent this to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. And he said, "What was the extent of the knee injury to Kaden Elliss in the final game of the season against the Saints following the deception by the Falcons regarding the severity of Kyle Pitts' knee injury? I'm highly suspect that the injury to Elliss will linger into next season." I am highly suspect. Jim, I recall you being the person that was emailing me back in June about, worried about Kyle Pitts' knee. And I told you not to worry about that. And I'm sure you probably look back at that and say, hey, I had every right to be worried about that. But I think this is another issue where I don't think you need to worry too much about it. Because again, this goes back to my mantra of you can control what you can control. We can't control whether or not the Falcons give us the details of these injuries. They're not obligated to give us the exact details of, they can just say, hey, Kaden Elliss injured his knee. That's all. That's the only information that we are obligated to know. And I guess we'll find out later this offseason, come April, come May, come June, whenever, if and when he's back on the practice field. And if he's not back on the practice field and they're saying, oh, he's not going to be ready till training camp, or he won't be ready until, week 1 or whatever, then we'll find out more information at that point in time. But, I don't know if the Falcons really control whether or not, how long it takes for Kaden Elliss to recover. What they do control, however, is, how strong their depth is. And that's going to be something that we're going to talk about later on today's episode. And that's why linebacker to me is sort of a quote unquote low key need in terms of building up depth that they can shore up this offseason. We'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But right now we're going to talk about, if we're looking for a Kaden Elliss fill-in, maybe that player is already on the roster in terms of Nate Landman. And why Nate Landman's role could potentially change moving forward, and why Troy Andersen is still a very valuable piece despite his injury plague season. We'll get into all of that, guys, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Now, DoorDash is crucial for your watch party for the upcoming big game, and whether you're looking to order pizza, wings, soda, burgers, nachos, chips, dip, or whatever, maybe you want to throw a vegetable in there, DoorDash is the place for you. Or maybe you just forgot to order the buns. You got everything ready, and DoorDash has got you so you can kick back and not stress before kickoff. DoorDash has the unbeatable deals on everything you can score this season on groceries, restaurant, retail, and so much more. Get 50% off up to a $10 value when you spend $15 or more on your first order. Just download the DoorDash app and enter code LOCK23. Subject to change, terms apply. Again, that's 50% off up to a $10 value when you spend $15 or more on your first order when you download the DoorDash app and enter code LOCK23. Subject to change, terms apply. Don't forget to use that code LOCK23, LOCKED23, for 50% off up to a $10 value on your first order when you download the DoorDash app and spend $15 or more. Subject to change, terms apply. And Prize Picks is the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. And now that the big game is finally here, it's finally demon time, guys. You can now win up to 100 times your money on your entries with just as little as four correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000. Demons and Goblins are the newest and most exciting way to play on Prize Picks. Squares marked with the red demons or green goblins just give you different payouts, and you can win up to 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. Big games, big payouts. It's all why Prize Picks is the #1 daily fantasy sports app. So many ways to win, and it's simple to play. Just pick 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projected stats, and it's you versus the projections. And even though there's 3 million members playing on Prize Picks, it's not, you're sitting there, you're not worried about, oh, how can I possibly win against 3 million people? No, it's you versus the projections, guys. You don't have to worry about any of those other 2,999,999 other people playing on it. And Prize Picks is basically giving you a free entry, because basically if Patrick Mahomes throws for more than 1 yard, just 1 yard in the upcoming big game, you won on Prize Picks. That's one entry that you nailed. You just got to come up with a few more, and you can win up to 100 times your payout and your money on your entry. So go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL in lowercase for a first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use promo code LockedOnNFL. Prize Picks is daily fantasy sports made easy. Continuing today's Locked On Falcons, want to plug the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel right here on YouTube, giving you the biggest stories on all the leagues across the globe. And if you're looking for more local flavor, check out the Locked On Sports Atlanta 24/7 streaming channel right here on YouTube to get the latest updates on the Braves, Bulldogs, Hawks, and Falcons. I always say Hawks weird. I'm just a weird person. All part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So we talked about Troy Andersen getting hurt in that Week 3 Lions game, and Nate Landman was asked to sort of step up and fill him. And Nate Landman did an admirable job. Right now, if you listen to this podcast, we weren't nearly as high on Nate Landman as maybe some other people were in the fan base, mostly because I sort of see Nate Landman as a high-level backup rather than a long-term starter that others might see him as. And, the simplest way I can explain that is linebackers are basically asked to play in 4 directions, right? You can go forward, right, which means, downhill, attacking the line of scrimmage. You can go side to side, east-west, in pursuit, all that stuff, coverage and whatnot. And you can go backwards, which is mostly coverage, right? And Landman's issues are that he is only really good going in one of those directions, which is forward. He's a very good downhill run defender, but as long as you keep him inside the hashes, like if you're asking him to make sideline to sideline plays, you're going to leave a little bit less desired. If you're asking him to drop into coverage, it's going to leave a little bit less desired. Now, he's functional in those areas. Obviously, he wasn't some massive liability in that, but the more and more you watch the film, the more and more you see like you are stretching him to his limits, right? And I think putting him on the field as a full-time starter is only going to continue to stretch that, and that's going to lead to opposing teams being like, oh, we can attack that. That's the weak link in the chain, right? Especially the better offenses in the league. Now, it's not as if Kaden Elliss was great in these areas either. He's primarily that going forward type of linebacker, but the thing that Kaden Elliss brings to the table that Nate Landman doesn't quite get there is Kaden Elliss is a plus pass rusher, hailing from his days as a true edge rusher in college at Idaho or wherever he played. And that plus pass rushing ability gives you something of value on third downs. It's a passing league, right? And Landman's not really giving you that on those third downs, right? He's mostly a run defender. He's giving you the stuff on early downs, but, 2 down linebackers, gone the way of the dodo, ask Ed Hartwell, right? But I do think in a world where Kaden Elliss is limited, as we just discussed, going into the season, Landman gives you enough as a pass rusher moving forward that he can be a functional replacement for, Kaden Elliss in that arena. But ultimately, if the Falcons' goal is to build a championship caliber defense, which I think we all assume should be their goal, I do think Landman presents you with some limitations, right? Because if we're thinking about it, again, obviously, who are going to be those teams in 2025, 2026? Who knows at this point in time? But let's say the Falcons were in the NFC title game this past year and they're going up against the Lions or they're going up against the 49ers. Is a guy that runs a 4.89 40 like Nate Landman the guy that you want to put on a running back like Jahmyr Gibbs who runs a 4.36, or Sam Laporta who runs a 4.59, or George Kittle who runs a 4.4 whatever he runs, or Christian McCaffrey and whatever he runs? Like, yeah, that's probably going to be a problem. It's kind of the point I'm trying to make. That's a mismatch waiting to happen. And so I look at Nate Landman's 2023 season and I say, hey, that's an applause, golf clap for getting what you got out of Nate Landman this year. But I kind of think he's already kind of peaked. Now, when you contrast that with Troy Andersen, I think Troy Andersen's only scratching the surface of his potential, right? And he is the type of player that theoretically, potentially, you could put on a Jahmyr Gibbs, you could put on a Sam Laporta, you could put on a George Kittle or Christian McCaffrey and feel pretty comfortable, theoretically, that he can neutralize those types of players because of the athlete that he is, right? But he's not there yet. And unfortunately, the injury kind of derailed his progress in that regard, because prior to that injury, we were looking at this year in 2023 for Troy Andersen as, okay, he just needs the reps. This is going to be maybe a little bit of a roller coaster, up and down, growing pain type of season, like in the same way that we kind of thought about with Desmond Ridder. It's going to be a little bit of a roller coaster as he gets his feet wet. Troy Andersen was kind of the defensive equivalent to that, because we knew coming out of Montana State, he was a fairly raw player, athletic, but needs the reps, right? And up and down first year as a starter in 2023. But unfortunately, we didn't really get that because we only got 2 games of him. And we did get glimpses of that up and down in those 2 starts, but, we needed to see more of that. And now I guess 2024 is going to be that growing pains year, right? And that only leaves you 1 more year left on his rookie contract, 2025, where, things need to click before he becomes a free agent. You have to make a decision on whether or not he's going to be the long-term linebacker that we, and be that guy that can check the Jahmyr Gibbses and the Sam Laportas and the Christian McCaffreys in the future, should the Falcons get there, right? And before, theoretically, if he had that growing pains years in 2023, you would have had 2 years for it all to kind of click together. And that, basically what's happened is now your margin for error has shrunk. Now, Andersen is the type of linebacker that can move well in all 4 directions, right? From an athletic standpoint. Physically, he's there. It's the mental stuff that he needs to get there. And, it's certainly possible that we get to, 9 months from now and we're doing a podcast with Jarvis Davis here on Locked On Falcons. And we're talking about, hey, Troy Andersen's struggling, right? And there's going to be a push. And I know Jarvis probably be leading that push. He's not a Troy Andersen fan at this point in time, right? He's not a hater or anything. Like, he's just like, I need to see it, right? And Jarvis might be leading that push to, hey, Nate Landman wasn't struggling like this, put him back in the lineup. And we may cross that bridge when we get to it. But I personally think sitting here today, and we'll see how it plays out over the next 9+ months. But I personally think that whatever short-term gains you're getting from that are setting you back long-term, because this defense's ceiling is going to be a lot higher if it clicks for Troy Andersen. But that's a big if, right? It's not a win at this point. It's an if it clicks for Troy Andersen. So that's why, like, I'm Team Troy, I guess you could say, hashtag Team Troy, right? You're on hashtag Team Nate or whatever. I get it. But I do think, for those reasons I've just explained, I think, the potential, the roof gets raised if Troy Andersen, turns into the player. But, we talked about the three main linebackers on the team. Adding some more depth, I think, is low-key a need, because losing Troy Andersen this year exposed the lack of athleticism, the lack of depth this year. Maybe adding another coverage guy to the mix makes a ton of sense in the event that, Troy Andersen gets hurt again, as well as, it's possible that the Falcons don't look at their linebacker position as, oh, we just need to add some depth. Maybe Raheem Morris is like, look, let's shake things up. Let's go out there and bring in a brand new starter. And we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. This next segment is brought to us by our proud sponsor, BetterHelp. And sometimes we all need the opportunity to get something off our chest. Big or small, certain things can really start to get to you in life. And it's important to let it out, especially to someone who's unbiased on your life. And while I just told you how I really feel about Nate Landman and Troy Andersen and the rest of the Falcons linebacker core, I also have some thoughts on who this fourth linebacker should be on the depth chart. But sometimes you might have different things you want to share. Therapy can be different for everyone, and most of us have bigger problems than what our favorite sports team is doing and who's the fourth linebacker on their depth chart. And it's important to get those things off your chest every once in a while. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon, and you'll get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. So continuing on your first listen of the day for the everydayers out there, tomorrow we'll probably be talking corners, and then we'll wrap up the week with safeties, and then at some point we'll do special teams. It matters in terms of our season review, and then next week I think we'll get into some quarterback stuff. We'll start talking more about the Falcons' plethora of options at quarterback, as well as some draft stuff with Combine coming up, and we'll start digging into some of these schematic things that we're talking about on some of these episodes. So a lot in store for you in the month of February. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Now, wrapping up today's episode, we look at the impending free agents. Andre Smith is a free agent. I don't expect him to be back. He was mostly a special teams player. And then when he did get opportunities late in the season due to some injuries to guys like Kaden Elliss and Nate Landman, he was even a bigger liability in coverage, which, I felt like, you didn't have better options this past year, but now you have an opportunity to get better options. Now, I think they could sign a fourth linebacker, and someone like a Troy Reader, who played for Raheem Morris in the last couple of years with the Rams, makes a ton of sense. He's a special teams player. That's his primary function. He did start games down the stretch in that Super Bowl run back in 2021 for the Rams. And I did see a quote that, Raheem Morris said, "Oh, Troy is one of my favorite players," although I'm sure Raheem says that about a lot of players. And so it would make sense for the Falcons to bring him in as a fourth linebacker. But, Reader's on the older side. He's going to be 30 in September. And so ideally, I think you're probably wanting to get a little bit younger, a little bit more athletic, add some youth, some speed, some athleticism at this position, rather than going with an older, declining special teams player that is not as spry as he once was, like Troy Reader. And so, I think that means, potentially drafting a day 3 guy, a late round guy. I think that's where you can get that sort of developmental depth at the linebacker position. Now, in terms of who or some of those options, I have no clue, guys. I haven't even begun to really break down the linebacker prospects. We got bigger fish to fry, like quarterbacks and whatnot. That will be probably something that we might address a little bit closer to draft time. But it is worth noting that, while I sit here and say, oh, they can wait till day 3 and get a fourth linebacker or something like that, Raheem Morris might have different plans. He might say, look, as good as Kaden Elliss, as good as Troy Andersen are, as good as Nate Landman is, this is a position that we can completely remake, right? Or, it could be due to the injury and the question marks surrounding Troy Andersen's coming off the torn pectoral, whatever the mysterious, deceptive, as Jim would put it, knee injury that Kaden Elliss suffered in that Week 18 finale against the Saints. And that means that we might need a little bit more than Nate Landman. And again, as I suggested, Nate Landman has limitations potentially as a starter. And so maybe the Falcons could enter free agency shopping for a starter rather than just looking for depth. And, that I would imagine would be a free agent option rather than waiting to the draft to get a plug and play starter at that point. So, would be remiss if we didn't wrap up today's episode talking about, or at least mentioning, some of the bigger names that could potentially hit the market this offseason. If you're looking for that sort of veteran leadership presence, right? Levante David is a free agent. Bobby Wagner, who played for the Rams in 2022, and Jordan Hicks are some of the veteran guys. If you're looking for some of the young up and coming guys that, may hit the market, that are looking for paydays, Patrick Queen from the Ravens, Jordan Brooks from the Seahawks, Azeez Al-Shaair from the Titans, formerly of the 49ers, Devin White of the Bucks, Willie Gay of the Chiefs, right? If you're looking for, that sort of downhill blitzing guy, Frankie Louvu from the Panthers is very good in terms of filling that Kaden Elliss-like shoes. Josie Jewell from the Broncos is a solid sort of all-around, maybe a rich man's Nate Landman or something like that. Blake Cashman's an athletic guy from the Jets. Drew Tranquil, also from the Chiefs. Gay and Tranquil, you guys get to see both of those guys play in the big game this weekend. And so you can do some early scouting for some potential options there. So those are some of the options there. Again, I guess we'll find out, to answer Jim's question at some point. We might get our answer on how serious Kaden Ellis's knee injury is if the Falcons go out there in March and spend a little bit more money at that linebacker position than at least initially what we've been talking about for most of the first 20 minutes of this podcast, thinking that they'll do. So I guess we'll get those answers eventually. So Jim, I just say be patient and we'll find out. The truth will come out in the end. So there is our linebacker breakdown. We'll talk more corners tomorrow, and we'll see what other news, if anything else out there is worthy of, that premium Falcons content here on your first listen here on this illustrious podcast, Locked On Falcons. Check out Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Sports Today's 24/7 streaming YouTube channels. Check out Locked On NFL, of course, if you're getting geared up for the big game. Check out Locked On Chiefs, Locked On 49ers. They got you covered all week long. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, guys. Your team every